In 1955, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. With that began what is known as the Khrushchev era of the Cold War. The Khrushchev era is signified by its anti-Stalinist policies, the Warsaw Pact, the uprisings in Eastern Europe, the buildup of nuclear weapons by the USSR, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what is called a general thaw in the Cold War. To signify his power, Khrushchev gave what is known as the secret speech to a group of his advisors, in which he denounced Stalin and his policies. This speech signified to the West a growing openness from the East, so the secret speech is viewed as an event that began the thaw. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was passed. As the East's response to NATO, the pact turned the war into a global conflict, pitting the US and its allies against the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Khrushchev also believed that a buildup of nuclear devices would deter countries from using traditional warfare, what is known as mutually assured destruction theory, or simply MAD. By the end of Khrushchev's time as head of the Soviet Union, the USSR had more nukes than the US. The nuclear arms race made the Cold War a much more dangerous game to play now that both sides had nuclear capabilities. During Khrushchev's reign, a series of uprisings expanded the USSR's sphere of influence, but also proved that some Eastern European nations did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. The first of these uprisings was East Germany, 1953, when Khrushchev was not yet ruler. GDR workers went on strike, and the USSR had to put down the riots by force. The next of these protests took place in Poland in 1956. Polish workers put on demonstrations demanding better conditions and were met with brutal force. 400 tanks and over 10,000 soldiers from the Polish army were ordered to fire on civilians. About 80 people died. The Soviet Union had consolidated its hold on Poland, but at the price of the support from many Poles. The Hungarian Revolution was the second uprising in Eastern Europe. During the revolution, a new Hungarian government came to power and declared its intention to leave the Warsaw Pact. In response, the Soviets sent a large military force and crushed the revolutionary government. A new pro-USSR government was installed in the wake of the revolution. Both of these events illustrate the unpredictability of Khrushchev. He had declared his intentions to give people under the Soviet Union's control more freedoms, and yet, when these freedoms were asked for, he sent a military force to suppress the people. This unpredictability made it very hard for the US to deal with Khrushchev's Soviet Union, and would trouble them later in the Cold War. In 1956, the Suez Crisis took place between Britain, France, and Israel on one side, and Egypt backed by the Soviet Union on the other. The details are not so important, but what is important is that France and Britain pulled out at the request of the US, which solidified the fall in Western European hegemony and the fact that the Cold War was really between the US and the Soviet Union. In 1961, the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba. This event shows Khrushchev's tendency to go back on his former announcements, as he had claimed to be in favor of peaceful coexistence with the West. The crisis arose when Khrushchev refused to remove the missiles, and many people feared nuclear conflict. The crisis also illustrates the dangers of Khrushchev's unpredictability when it came to foreign policy. He changed the Cold War by almost turning it into a guessing game for the US and NATO. The Cuban Missile Crisis was finally resolved by the US removing missiles it had in Turkey, to the relief of pretty much everybody. Nikita Khrushchev left his mark on the world during his time as leader of the Soviet Union. Through the Warsaw Pact and his putting down of multiple uprisings, he made the Cold War a global conflict between only two major powers, the US and the USSR. He also dramatically increased the Soviet Union's supply of nuclear weapons, giving the conflict a much greater scale. Finally, Khrushchev's unpredictability during the Cold War changed the way the US and NATO had to think about the conflict, making the Cold War potentially the most dangerous war in history.